Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us for today's webinar. My name is Sasha Chan, and I'm part of the marketing team at CityBase. CityBase is a Chicago-based government technology company that transforms the way cities connect and do business with constituents. CityBase works with local governments, agencies, and utilities to integrate payment functionality, business processes, and communications onto a central cloud-based platform that consumers can access through the web, mobile, kiosk, or point of sale. Today we are presenting The Science of Design, Products for the Public, presented by Jason Maeder, Amanda Sue, and Madeline Allen. In today's agenda, we'll discover the design process, we'll go through a case study, RFPs, do's and don'ts, and Q&A. Just a little housekeeping before we get started. If you have any questions during the presentation, please type them into the question box by clicking on the Ask a Question button on the left-hand corner of your screen. We have a dedicated Q&A section at the end. Now, without further ado, we will turn time over to Jason Maeder, the Director of Product Management at CityBase.
All right, thank you, Sasha, and thank you all for spending a part of your morning with us today. I'm going to spend some time just going over our design process here at CityBase. We've worked on this process for several years now. It's been crafted by many of our very talented designers and research professionals that have worked here at CityBase, and it's something we're constantly evaluating and improving, and something that I expect will continue to evolve into the future as well. To begin, let's just do a quick overview of our process, and then I'll dive into some details on each of them. But the foundation of our process really lies in 4 key steps. The first step, which is the discover phase, is all about understanding the problem we are trying to solve and the world in which that problem lives, and any contextual information about that problem that's meaningful to us. The second step is our define phase, and that define phase is where we narrow down our focus on the problem or set of problems that we think we can solve for our users. The third step is our develop stage, and during that stage, we're creating lots of potential solutions to these problems that we identified in the prior step. And we work with real users to try and validate these solutions, or even at this point start eliminating potential solutions that we've come up with. And finally, in our deliver stage, we pick one of those solutions. We identify a single solution that meets the needs of our users, and we look at those solutions in greater detail to try and understand the best solution for our users. So let's dive in a little deeper in each one of these 4 steps. So in the first stage, the discover stage, we have inputs and outputs in every stage. The inputs are the things that we need to know or need to go off and research in order to achieve the goal of that stage. The outputs are the artifacts that we create and are used to preserve our findings for later, to share with teammates, or to refer back to as we go through the software development process. I had mentioned in the discover phase before that it's all about understanding the problem we're trying to solve and that world that it lives in. And the world can include many things. You see some of them listed on the left-hand side there, information about the market, about the users, about the solutions that they're using today. Focusing specifically on the users and the stakeholders, I can't emphasize enough the importance of understanding the users, the influencers, and the buyers early on in the process. These players control the success of your solution. So getting into the field, not just reading about them or sometimes talking to them on the phone, but actually getting in the field and meeting them will establish a solid foundation for your team and a better solution in the end. Just one point on the existing solutions as well on the left-hand side there. It's more than just a competitive analysis. Competitive analysis is certainly useful and is certainly helpful to understand the other types of solutions that are offered in the market, but sometimes the existing solutions that your customers or your prospects are using today are as simple as pen and paper or email and spreadsheets. So getting into the field, meeting these users, understanding how they're solving their problems today gives you a better understanding of their use of technology and their expectations of a solution that you're going to deliver to them later. So it can greatly influence, your definition of an MVP solution. So second, on the define, this is again where we're narrowing our focus into a problem or a set of problems that we think we can solve. Using some of those outputs from the discover phase, we can draw some initial conclusions about how users work today, where we think we can help, where we think we can certainly not help them, and sometimes we even make a decision about not even continuing at all. So this is a step where we understand the problems that they're facing and the pain points, and it's not in our wheelhouse. It's an opportunity for us to step back and say it's just not a good fit for us and move on to something we think is a better fit for ourselves and for our customers. So this whole define phase and exercise helps us challenge our assumptions and our ideas, and helps us come out with thoughtful and strategic solutions that align to both our core competencies and our product roadmap. So in the develop stage, we are focused on creating many potential solutions to those problems that we've identified in the previous step. We work with real users to validate our ideas or eliminate some of those potential solutions. And now that we're focused on a finite problem set, we can brainstorm with potential users and buyers about our ideas and get their feedback and make sure we're on the right track before moving any farther. We create low-fidelity designs and prototypes to help communicate our vision of that solution and have more meaningful conversations with those users to get their feedback on our vision, and again, making sure we're headed in the right direction. So the learnings from these discussions help to evolve these low-fidelity designs into a closer representation of the final solution. And that's in the in the deliver stage, the final stage, where we put those finishing touches on the solution. So we think through all of the happy path scenarios as well as those corner cases that we know our users will get into. We build high-fidelity designs and detailed product specifications, all with the goal that development teams can get a clear vision of where we're headed and what we're trying to build and the problem we're trying to solve for our customers, but can also pick up these final outputs and begin work. So I wanted to share an example that helps illustrate the importance of a process like this and how it plays out in the real world. So I know that the initial reaction sometimes when we talk about this is that it can be pretty intense. It can seem overwhelming or cumbersome. It's a lot of work to make sure that we are headed in the right direction, but we feel like it's a very necessary part of the solution process because it informs and empowers our entire team to make decisions quickly with a high level of accuracy throughout the entire product development lifecycle. So as a reference, in aviation, there's something called this 1 in 60 rule. It's a rule of thumb that a heading error of 1 degree will result in being about a mile off track after traveling 60 miles. So if your heading is off by 15 degrees, for example, you'll be 15 miles off track. The same principle can be applied to software development. So if your strategy is off by just 15 degrees on a $600,000 project, you'll need about $150,000 worth of work, additional work, to get back to where you should have been if you were on target. So landing on your target takes a lot of planning, it takes a lot of research and focus, but it's worth it in the end. So just another quick example here. We all remember Google Glass. It was that Google project that had visions of people walking down the street with these futuristic glasses on, and it was giving people email and text notifications or advertisements of the sushi place they just passed on the street, all within their field of vision. But what they didn't understand was that despite their best efforts to make Google Glass mainstream, the average consumer had two major problems with them. One, they weren't fashionable enough for people to want to wear every day. And two, they didn't really solve a real problem for everyday consumers. But after many years of development and millions of dollars of investment, Google finally found a user that they could overcome these two challenges with. They are hands-on workplace employees in industries such as manufacturing, mechanical, healthcare, or logistics. These workers find meaningful value in contextual information in their field of vision during a task. And they're already required to wear protective eyewear, so therefore they don't care about the appearance of the glasses on their face. So my question, my challenge to you is to imagine how would the Google Glass story be different if Google started with this market as their target? And if they better understood their target users before they started this project, do you think they would have started at all? So to show you how this process comes to life here at CityBase, I'd like to introduce Amanda Sue. She is the designer on our case management solution.
Thanks, Jason. So I'm Amanda, and I work on a product we call the Case Management Technology Dashboard, formerly known as Green Door. We built this tool to help government workers basically move away from the long string of PDFs and emails and phone calls that comprises the typical constituent interaction, and basically consolidate this into one easy online experience. So some of the things that you can do with case management, you can build complex forms with conditional logic, you can intake and organize form responses, and you can collaborate with coworkers and other agencies to evaluate these responses. Basically a whole suite of functionality around collecting and evaluating form data. So just to give you an idea of the kinds of use cases that our customers use Greendoor for, we have government agencies at the city, state, and federal level using case management for a variety of purposes. Our focus right now is permitting, but we've also seen customers use it to manage grant applications, conduct surveys, and collect RFP responses. Based on what we've heard from these customers, we know that they tend to value the case management tool, especially for its rich form building capabilities, the evaluation features, and workflow management. But permitting and RFPs aren't the only thing you can use case management for. We also have customers in the media and nonprofit sectors who use it for research and recruiting. These customers in particular like the case management tool for its ability to organize and search large volume of responses with high granularity. So with that, I'd like to move into our process for developing the product. A large part of designing a successful product, we believe, is identifying the right problem to solve. So to that end, we make a point of having regular conversations with our customers to make sure we understand their needs. So these conversations can take the form of customer interviews that we regularly schedule, introductory phone calls with new customers to tailor the product to their needs, and just organic conversations that arrive through our support team. I personally consider myself to be really lucky to be working in a space like government, where we have many engaged and passionate users willing to spend time helping us to understand their problem and design a better product. So we track all of these conversations in a document we call Pain Points, and it basically helps us keep a pulse on customer needs, which in turn directly influences what features we decide to build in the short term and the long term. So what we're looking at here is actually a snapshot of that spreadsheet. Obviously, one feature request stood out above all of the rest. Of the customers we spoke to, 13 of them said they needed better support for projects with multiple stages, or more specifically, multiple forms. Internally, the team refers to this feature as follow-up forms. And this was easily our top request from users across all sectors for the past 1.5 years. So just to dive into what exactly this is, in case management, there is this concept of projects. So an example of a project might be your city's business permit application, a constituent feedback survey, or a job application, just to give a few examples of what people use it for. So currently, each project can contain one form. This isn't really ideal for something like a business permit, which requires many different forms and documents to be submitted over time. For example, the City of San Francisco is currently setting up their cannabis business permit in case management. They have, part of the application is an initial application form to pre-approve the business owner, but then there are all these other forms that they need to send based on varying conditions, such as building inspection forms, community outreach, operating procedures, and so on. In the current version of case management, which we see here, these individual forms need to be managed as separate projects with separate buckets of responses. This is not very efficient. So with the idea of follow-up forms, you want to be able to manage all the business permit forms along with their responses in one place. This would allow users to manage form publishing and evaluation for the whole permit more efficiently. So here are some of the specific needs that we heard from customers around follow-up forms. First off, they want to manage all of their forms and their responses in one place. They'd like to see all the responses from a given respondent in one place. So this would be the case in case management. They'd like to be able to send a follow-up form to multiple respondents at the same time. And they'd also like to automatically send forms to respondents based on previous answers. So for example, if a potential business owner indicated in their initial application that they plan to conduct manufacturing activities on site, you might want to automatically send them the appropriate facility inspection paperwork. So these features may seem straightforward enough from a user's perspective, but follow-up forms actually presented a really huge change for the product. It was probably our most ambitious feature to date. We had to rewrite a good chunk of the architecture just to let projects have multiple forms. So similarly, on the front end, we had to rework the user experience of almost all of the product key features to support follow-up forms. So in software development, there's a method that developers use to decode bugs called rubber duck programming. So the idea is you keep a rubber duck on your desk, and if you run into a problem you can't solve, you take the duck and you force yourself to explain the problem to it line by line. The idea behind this is the process of breaking a problem down into a simple narrative can help surface the root issues and maybe even a solution. So the case management team has historically relied on this method pretty heavily, partly because we started out as a distributed team, but also because I think we found this method of writing and syncing to be extremely effective. And we don't just use it to decode bugs, we also use it to solve design problems. Every problem on the case management team starts with someone writing about it. So what the problem is, how we learned about it, and a proposed solution if there are any. So to help us break down the beastly follow-up forms feature, as one of our developers put it, we dumped a list of these features into a spreadsheet and started up conversations in line about how each of these features would be impacted with the new follow-up forms model. So it would start off with the product manager dropping her initial thoughts in, and then the designer, me, would follow up, as well as the developers. It's maybe not the fanciest way to go about doing it, but it did allow us to systematically tackle the laundry list of features while easily referencing other conversations to ensure that we were maintaining a coherent user experience. User flows are used in UX to break down the steps that the user takes to achieve a goal. And it's ideally informed directly by user research, but in the case of follow-up forms, we already knew how people create and send a form in case management. So we could take that existing flow and use it to hypothesize what new steps and elements might be required for follow-up forms. So the blue components here represent new pieces of functionality. I'd like to note that these boxes don't necessarily represent new pages or even features. At this point, we want to stay focused on the task without jumping to solutions or ideas of what the feature might look like. The reason for this is we want to avoid becoming married to the solution too early and failing to explore all the possible options. And this is why the shared task list for our team is written as outcomes and not solutions. So in the user experience world, there's a mantra, test early and often. In other words, you want to get your ideas in front of users, real users, as soon as possible. There are several reasons for this. One, we are not the user. We may have a good sense overall for users' likes and dislikes, but it's extremely difficult to really place yourself in a user's everyday shoes, let alone predict how they'll interact with a new feature. Secondly, as Jason mentioned, it's cheaper to make changes early, rather than a few months down the road when you've invested more financially and perhaps emotionally in a particular solution. So as soon as we had a viable design, I wrote up some research questions, which is basically a list of things you want to learn. It's good practice to do this so you have clear goals to design the test around, as opposed to sitting around and bantering with users all day, which I have been known to do. These goals can also serve as acceptance criteria. Basically, if you've answered these questions to a reasonable degree of satisfaction, you're probably ready to take another stab at the design. Another thing you need to prepare before testing is a prototype. We use a prototyping app called Marble, which simply strings together static mockups. These prototypes don't need to be highly functional because we've got our research goals, we know exactly what we want to test, and we only have to build what we test. Finally, there is also a script. And this ensures that we ask all the questions we need to ask to answer our research questions, and that all test participants undergo the same consistent test, and that variations between tests don't skew the results. So while we're preparing all these test materials, we're also reaching out to existing customers to be willing to lend their time for a user test. We tested on average 2 to 3 users per week for a month, iterating on the design each time. And at the end, I wrote up a test report. Because we were testing on a weekly basis, I did keep these reports relatively simple. So just key observations that we made and recommendations for the next iteration of the design. So just to give an example of something that we designed and tested, follow-up forms, we looked at where to put a link to create the first follow-up form. One option was to drop it on this page, which is where you currently edit your one form. However, people had a hard time finding it even while looking directly at the page. You saw users clicking on the tab below the form title, or clicking on the pencil icon near business permit, thinking that pencil equals edit. Another option was to put the button on the project homepage, which worked a little bit better. Users were still looking to the edit link because that's where they currently go to edit their form, but eventually it would lead them to the right button. So now I'm going to talk briefly about the final design and the deliverables that came out of this process. To document the final design for our developers, I created a series of small prototypes, each capturing a specific user task. Because the case management tool's visual style was already built into the code, I didn't have to document things like colors, font size, or even what a button looks like, just focusing on flows and interactions. So once again, I used Marvel to document the interface design as well as the behavior, so things like what happens when a user clicks here. And Marvel has a commenting feature that allowed me to annotate the design, so basically leaving notes for the developers with instructions, as well as take feedback and questions from the rest of the team. I call this phase document and discuss because it's important to loop developers into design conversations, not only to gauge feasibility, but also to make sure they have everything they need to start building. So looking forward, in software development, we have something called a beta phase, in which a small group of users signs up to use a new feature and provide feedback before launching to the public. This is to make sure that we have all of our ducks in a row. It was really especially imperative for us to have someone test follow-up forms and all of the impacted features in the real world because of the extensive changes to the product. Lucky for us, the city of San Francisco is currently using follow-up forms to host their cannabis business permit application, and we're learning a great deal from them in the process. And with all that feedback, we are slated to launch follow-up forms to the public on February 14th. And now to tell you about what to look for in UX vendors, here is Madeline.
Thank you, Amanda. My name is Madeline, and I manage the RFP process here at CityBase. Today, I'm excited to take this conversation to a higher level and look at ways to instill UX best practices into the RFP process. To start, user experience design is big business, and there's money to be made. Recently, Forbes reported that on average, the ROI for user experience is 9,900%, which translates into a $100 return for every dollar invested. To achieve numbers like that, designers need to be consistent in their delivery of excellent and precise user experience. In the next few slides, we'll look at ways to use the RFP process to attract top vendors that are most likely to ensure a successful UX project. To start, RFPs can be used as a vehicle to communicate and enhance the argument for UX design. They can give stakeholders an understanding of a project and its scope. They can be used to align strategy, budget, and expectations to ensure success. They can be used as a reference point for everybody involved in the project. And lastly, they can communicate your needs and values to vendors. As you construct your RFP, human-centric design should be at the heart of the entire development process. So to help with this, I've formulated a few tips to serve as building blocks, beginning with some important do's and don'ts. So let's start with the don'ts. Don't ask questions that will be limiting. Limiting questions may lead vendors to believe you're tied to specific tools, versions, or functionality. Open-ended questions provide the opportunity for designers to be creative in their approach to your problems. Secondly, don't be unspecific, subjective, or vague about objectives. If an RFP is too vague, vendors can easily get hung up on assumptions, what-ifs, and overall confusion as to what the exact issue is and why it needs to be solved. Don't assume everyone has been involved in the writing process. Most people are busy, so most likely not every person who should be involved can be involved. If you're confused, involve the right people. It's best to do this in the beginning. Once stakeholders understand the benefits, they will be more likely to get on board with your UX proposal. And lastly, don't ask questions or add functionality specifications that quote-unquote sound good. During the initial stages of your proposal, avoid the desire of solving problems and instead truly listen to the needs and pain points. Ask for recommendations from professionals who spend every day doing this type of work. Now, let's move on to some of the tips to keep in mind. So first and foremost, simplify. Your RFP shouldn't be more complicated than it needs to be. When dealing with UX, it's possible to get caught up in the specifications, but such a detailed outline can unnecessarily stifle innovative solutions proposed by your vendors. One good way to keep RFPs simple is to focus on the why rather than the how. Second, provide background information and define the problem. Identify clearly in plain language what the problem is and why you're trying to solve it. Sometimes narrowing down the problem statement to one sentence can help eliminate confusing jargon and unnecessary information that might derail the vendor from identifying the exact issues and why you need them as a UX team to solve them. Third, try to target questions that result in answers regarding benefits rather than features. Despite UX design's high ROI, its benefits are still not universally acknowledged. To attract the best vendors, highlight the desired benefits that you desire. A good example of this is in the context of a phone application, is a customer may not necessarily care if there is a phone app, but rather they will care if there's a higher service fee or longer process. Communicate your project budget as a range rather than a single number. UX design decisions rely heavily on in-depth research and investigation. As Jason mentioned, the smallest change to a UI element on a project can cost thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of dollars. The right UX firm will let you know how easy, cheap, difficult, costly, various avenues to meet that objective will be. By providing a flexible budget range, you are giving vendors room to explain their products and benefits in the context of their offering. And lastly, send the right RFP to the right vendors. Effectively articulating a challenge can be nearly as complex as solving it. The energy and resources you invest early on will help you inform your ability to identify the right partner for the task, align on strategy, and minimize the ramp-up time needed after kickoff. With the do's and don'ts in mind, I've put together a few sample questions that may be helpful as you formulate your UX RFPs. So to begin, how will design affect how well we will be able to solve the problem? How will this be measured? A successful vendor will use this question to highlight how design impacts the entire process from day one to deployment. They will break down the deliverables into stages or phases so that the scope of work is less momentous and so that it will be easier to estimate and gauge the impact of design on how well they're able to solve the problem. Additionally, the vendor, by staying focused on just a couple of issues at a time, can prevent the team from being overwhelmed and create a better workflow. Specifically, a vendor may highlight the positive impacts of design-based development, such as better products, streamlined workflow, less risk, and insight discovery. Question number 2, how do you involve key stakeholders throughout the design phase? Good UX design can bring profit to the business. Getting stakeholders on board to understand this is a different story. A well-defined and thought-out UX proposal can give designers the buy-in, influence, and control they need to deliver a successful user experience. Getting key team players involved in this process is necessary, considering the majority of UX professionals collaborate with other team members on deliverables they produce. Vendors should outline a communication and implementation strategy that involves these stakeholders throughout the process, making sure that they are heard and provided consistent updates regarding the project. And lastly, display your ability to work across a wide variety of use cases. The response to this question should address whether or not their other work is relevant and if they are willing to adapt and work with you as a partner. First, a great UX proposal should include a track record of success of experienced people who have the ability to work with their own team members. Second, the vendor response should display their ability to embed themselves within your team and never miss a beat. Most importantly, keep an open mind. Many times during these initial discussions with vendors, there are other value-added services or use cases that they may provide that you weren't aware of and that may benefit the project at hand. So as we wrap up this section, I'll pass it back to Sasha for a Q&A.
Thanks, Madeline, Amanda, and Jason. That was a wonderful presentation. We will now start the Q&A portion of our presentation. As a reminder, if you have not already done so, please type them into the question box by clicking on the Ask a Question button on the left-hand corner of your screen. We will try to get through as many questions as possible, but if we don't, we will be sure to address it after the webinar. Jason, the first question is for you. Your 4-step processes feel very heavy. How do you ensure you still move quickly and deliver features fast?
There are a couple of things that we do. So the first thing that comes to mind is that I laid out that 4-step process, and each one of those 4 steps has a bunch of activities underneath each step. But we only do the steps that are necessary for the problem we're trying to solve. So sometimes if we are working in an industry or with users that we're familiar with, we can reduce some of the steps in like the early stages. So we don't go through every step just for the activity of going through every step. We go through the ones that we think will help identify the best solution and the things that we don't know today. The other thing that we do, because we don't want this to be a bottleneck for the development team, the development team still work in 2-week sprints. They still work through and release code quickly, and we believe in delivering value fast to users. So we are doing most of this work ahead of time. We work our roadmaps at least a quarter ahead, and so a lot of this research work is happening while the teams are working on other priorities. So we also eliminate a lot of like stops and starts by failing fast and doing this research, identifying the problems, and getting these questions answered ahead of time before they even start work. And I guess the last thing I would say is we actually include the development team in a lot of this. So we try and educate them and give them the background and the knowledge so that they can have a better understanding of the users and the problems we're trying to solve, so that we're not spending so much time either going back out and trying to find users or chasing around the product manager to get an answer from a research activity or one of the designers. So it is a lot. But as I mentioned before, I think it's worth it, and we try and find that right balance between doing enough to identify the right solutions while feeding the team work quickly to deliver to our users.
Great, thanks. Amanda, I think this next question is good for you. How do you ensure test participants are representative of all your users?
So for each test, assuming it's a global feature, we make sure to have at least one user from each sector that we're designing for. If we're designing for a specific use case, we use prior research to make sure we have an understanding for the key user groups involved. So for example, like permitting, for example, we learned that there are 3 major user groups that are involved in a typical permit approval process. So there's usually a permit owner who's like an administrative role at whatever agency owns the permit, and then there's an approver who can work at some other agency or department that has some responsibility for signing off on part of the permit. And then there's usually a technology arm that's responsible for setting up forms and integrations. So for a user test of how people use case management to administer a permit, we would make sure to include someone from each of those representative user groups.
Awesome. We're just going down the line. Madeline, there's a great question for you. What are some tangible ways to make sure government or utility RFPs get to the right vendors, best designers?
That's a great question. So there's 4 key parts to that, and I'll list those out and dive into them a little bit further. But 1, compile a list of recipients. 2, seek out recommendations. 3, I would do some research. And then 4, utilize the contacts that you already have. So when you're compiling a list of recipients, do some independent research and reach out to your contacts that are likely to send back the best replies. Only send the RFP to those vendors that have high odds of meeting your needs. So this saves time both on your end and the vendor's end. Secondly, seek out some recommendations. Utilize your network to identify others who may have gone through a similar process. And then using word of mouth as an effective advertising tool to basically identify others that have a similar experience. Third, do your research. There's no perfect formula for this, but there are people probably within your team and people you know that are knowledgeable about this type of project. And then lastly, working in the industry that you're in has probably caused you to meet a lot of other people. And so when you're looking at your contacts, dig through your contact books and come up with options for people that you may have already met that would be a good fit for the project.
Great. I have one question here. How do you use user tests when the end user is the general public? I think that's for Amanda or Jason.
Yeah, so in that case, we would probably use a recruiting platform. We've used one called usertesting.com in the past, and you can basically request a variety of demographics, but we've been able to get a good diversity of constituents to test the respondent-facing UI before.
Anything to add? No? All good? As I look through the questions, trying to understand a couple. Oh, someone's typing, so just give us 1 second. I guess for Madeline, in terms of the RFP, what are some best sources to find like the best designers to submit the RFP?
I guess I would just have to touch back on, out of the 4 that I listed, I think the best way to approach that would be to utilize your own network. So there's so many people that have gone through a very similar experience, and especially if you're in the gov tech space, it's likely that you've had colleagues or people that you've worked with before that have gone through a similar experience and are able to provide actually just names of companies that they've either worked with and had a great experience with, or that they haven't had a great experience with. And I think that's the best route, given the fact that there is so much information out there and there are so many companies, so it might be difficult to start broadly.
I have another RFP question. When you're writing an RFP, how do you make sure the solution will solve the problem without getting caught up on specific features?
Right, so obviously before the RFP there's the opportunity to issue an RFI, which I think is a really great opportunity to give your vendors more flexibility in how they would approach the issue. So using that stage to really gather more information about what is out there and what creative solutions could be applied to the project that you're working on is a really great first step. If you're already in the RFP process, I would again highlight the idea to really use questions that are related more around the how and the why versus the what. This really gives vendors the opportunity to address how they can provide a solution in a comprehensive way that not only meets the problem at hand, but really meets your overall business objectives.
Great. A product design question. Have you ever created changes in a product design and received complaints from users who like the original version? How do you handle this?
I'll take that one. Yeah. I mean, we don't always get it right. I think that's part of the practice of this. And so, yeah, if we've implemented a change that users don't like, we'll get that feedback. We'll get it from either our sales channel or our support teams. And I think the first step is always to understand why, to have a conversation with those users about what about the change don't they like? What is it limiting? Is it just not visually pleasing to them? Understand the root cause of the challenge, and then understand if that's an issue that most of our users or the majority of our users would face, and then address it as quickly as possible. I mean, depending on the severity of the issue. So, yeah, I mean, all this upfront work is to trying to avoid those situations, but we'll never claim to get it right 100% of the time, and just try and, get as close to 100% as we can. And I think that happens with a lot of conversation, but, that's always my first reaction to those types of issues is talk to the users and understand how we can do better.
Okay. Also, when you're creating solutions for a specific client, how do you balance the design process with the client's particular wishes?
So I'll take that one too. I think what we do pretty well here at CityBase is, trying to understand the overall needs of the market and our customer base, And if we have a customer who has some pretty specific needs, we have the ability to address those, even if they aren't, if they don't align directly to our roadmap. We try and find solutions and customers that have needs that align to our product roadmap or our existing solutions. And so that's definitely our target. But as things come in, which it always does, that someone needs, our solutions get us 80 or 90% of the way there, and there's a 10 to 20% gap we need to fill, we have an implementation team that can handle those types of customizations or configurations to make sure that the solution is a great fit for all of our customers.
Thanks, Jason. Looks like this is our last question. Madeline, as a vendor who responds to RFPs, have you ever responded to RFPs that are asking for specific solutions, but you think that they need something else to solve their problems?
Yeah, I think that, as technology develops, especially within UX, there's obviously a variety of ways to communicate what the actual problem is. And so in responding to RFPs, I think, it's doing a little bit of a dance as far as figuring out what the pain points actually are and reading between the lines. Obviously, there's some, stakeholders that are able to communicate more clearly in the most up-to-date language what their issues are, but more often than not, you're being hired for a reason, and so defining the problem could actually be a part of the project. And so in reading the RFPs, it's important to understand that context and try to identify the problem as clearly as possible.
All right, thanks. That looks like all the questions. Please feel free to send questions after this webinar if something comes to your mind. But I'd like to thank you all for spending your time with us. We hope you're walking away with insights on how to create solutions your users will love and best practices for user-driven design. Please watch your email for the on-demand recording of this video to share with colleagues. And please join us next month on February 20th for 2019 utility trends and February 21st for 2019 government trends. Thank you, and have a great day.